Let me take you back, slowly and gently, to the streets of 19th century England, a place where gaslight flickered faintly through the fog, where the sound of carriage wheels echoed over cobblestones, and where men and women hurried home from long days of work with weary bodies and even wearier minds. It was the age we call Victorian, an age of inventions, of railways and telegraphs, of factories whose chimneys poured smoke into the skies, and of homes filled with the chatter of children, the ticking of clocks, and the quiet heaviness of life. Yet beneath the surface of this industrious and respectable society lay another story, one not often spoken of with pride, but one that shaped daily existence for rich and poor alike. It was the story of drink and drugs, of alcohol poured in endless glasses, and of opium sipped quietly from dark little bottles. To live in Victorian England was, for many, to live with the constant presence of these substances, as ordinary as bread and butter, as familiar as the sound of the church bell. They were not whispered about as forbidden things, but rather accepted as companions, woven deeply into the fabric of life. If you were to walk down a street in London, or in Manchester, or in Birmingham during the middle of the 19th century, you would see taverns and public houses on nearly every corner, their doors swinging open to let in tired factory workers and let out the sounds of laughter and drunken song. The tavern was a refuge, a place to drown the misery of endless shifts spent in choking dust and deafening machinery. Inside, men leaned over wooden tables with tankards of beer, women gathered at the bar with gin, and children sometimes sat outside, waiting for their fathers to stumble home. The air was heavy with smoke and the smell of spilled alcohol, but it was also heavy with relief, for here was a momentary escape from the hunger and the hardship of the world outside. Gin especially had earned a reputation, its harsh taste burning down the throat, but its warmth quickly rising to the head. Beer was cheaper, all was plentiful, and brandy and rum filled the glasses of those with a few extra coins to spare. Yet drink was not the only solace. From the shelves of chemists and grocers, another kind of comfort was sold in small brown bottles. It was called Laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol, and it promised to ease pain, to quiet nerves, to help one sleep. For pennies, a mother could buy it to silence her crying baby. A laborer could swallow it to numb the aches of his body. A poet could sip it for the dreams and visions it inspired. In a world with little understanding of medicine as we know it today, laudanum was the cure for almost everything. Doctors prescribed it freely. Advertisements for patent medicines praised it, and families kept it on hand as naturally as one might keep flour or soap. To be dosed with laudanum was not to be scandalous. It was to be ordinary. And so opium spread quietly through all levels of society, binding the rich and the poor alike in its drowsy embrace. The working poor leaned more often on alcohol. Wages, already thin, sometimes disappeared entirely into the pub, leaving women and children to face the cold reality of empty cupboards. Social reformers railed against the drunkenness of the laboring classes, insisting that alcohol was the root of poverty, though in truth it was often the other way around, poverty itself driving men and women to seek solace in drink. In the dimly lit taverns, life was briefly softened. There was companionship, music, and laughter. There was the clink of coins and the shuffle of feet on sawdust floors. But outside those doors, families waited, and arguments often followed, for money lost to drink could mean hunger, eviction, or worse. The middle and upper classes indulged in their own ways. At dinner tables, wine flowed generously, brandy and sherry passed from hand to hand, and toasts filled the air. Among intellectuals, opium had a certain refinement. Writers and artists praised it for the inspiration it seemed to bring, though it also carried them into shadows from which they struggled to return. Thomas de Quincey wrote of his confessions as an English opium eater, describing both the wonders and the torments it brought. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, haunted by his visions, admitted his reliance on the drug, To them, opium was not only a medicine but a muse, both blessing and curse. In this way, the very same substance that silenced a poor child in a tenement soothed the troubled mind of a poet in his study. Perhaps the most chilling part of this tale is the way opium was given to children. Mothers who had to work long hours, or who simply could not bear the constant crying of a sick infant, turned to soothing syrups and cordials sold in every shop. They bore reassuring names: Godfrey's cordial, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, and they promised quiet nights. What they delivered was silence indeed, a heavy silence brought on by the presence of opium. Babies slept deeply, sometimes too deeply. There were stories of infants who never woke, but still the practice continued, for it seemed a necessary mercy in lives too burdened by hardship. By the middle of the century, voices of warning began to grow louder. Doctors noticed the dangers of dependency. Reformers condemned both alcohol and opium as destroyers of families and souls. The temperance movement took root, spreading across the country with pledges of total abstinence, with meetings filled with speeches, and with pamphlets urging people to put aside their glasses. Some embraced these ideas, swearing off alcohol entirely, while others scoffed, unwilling to let go of the only comfort they knew. Meanwhile, laws began to change. Restrictions on the sale of opium were introduced, requiring chemists to label medicines more clearly and to limit their strength. By the end of the century, the carefree ease with which opium had once been purchased was slowly tightening. Yet neither alcohol nor opium disappeared, for their hold on daily life was strong, and habits do not vanish simply because laws are passed. And so, through the long decades of the Victorian era, the people of England lived with their bottles and their glasses. They drank to forget, they dosed to sleep, they gathered in pubs for laughter and song, and they sat alone in quiet rooms with a vial of laudanum. These habits were not secret scandals, but everyday realities, part of a culture that sought relief from the weight of industrial life. The factories roared, the trains thundered, the cities swelled with people, and in the midst of it all, men and women sought small escapes. When we think back on this time, we often imagine the great inventions, the strict morals, the stiff collars, and the prim manners. But beneath those polished surfaces was a society deeply entwined with substances that dulled pain and blurred reality. Alcohol and opium were not simply vices, they were woven into survival, into ritual, into the daily rhythm of life. A pint at the tavern, a spoonful of cordial, a glass of port, a dose of tincture, each was a thread in the fabric of existence. And as the century gave way to the next, the shadows of these habits lingered. They shaped the generations that followed, influencing debates over addiction, over medicine, and over morality. The Victorians, for all their progress and pride, lived in a haze of drink and drug that both sustained and ensnared them. It was a quiet story, not often celebrated, but always present, in the streets and parlors, in the factories and the drawing rooms, in the laughter of taverns and the silence of nurseries. It is the story of a society that, in its quest for comfort, bound itself to bottles and vials, never quite able to let them go. Let us move more slowly now, further into the long shadowy corridors of Victorian England, where the presence of alcohol and opium continued to weave itself through every detail of life. Not only in the cities, but in the countryside. Not only in the taverns and slums, but also in parlors and drawing rooms, in hospitals and nurseries, in prisons and asylums. To understand this world more deeply is to notice how ordinary people lived their days, how they sought relief from suffering, how reformers fought to change habits that seemed impossible to break, and how these substances became both the medicine and the poison of an entire century. The story of drink and drug was not limited to London alone. It stretched across industrial towns, where the sound of hammers and spinning wheels filled the air, across villages where agricultural laborers bent their backs to the soil, and into the narrow cottages where families huddled together for warmth. In all of these places, the bottle was a companion. A man might finish his work in the fields, his body aching from endless toil, and turn to the local alehouse for solace. There, with neighbors around him, he might exchange stories, sing an old ballad, or simply sit in silence with a pint in his hand. The alehouse was more than a drinking place. It was a social center, a place where news was shared, where disputes were settled, and where the weariness of the world could be forgotten for a while. But alcohol was not always kind. The same tavern that provided laughter could also bring violence. Fights broke out, tempers flared, and drunkenness led to broken homes. Women wrote letters to newspapers begging for laws that would protect them from husbands who spent their wages on drink and returned home in anger. The temperance movement gained strength from these cries, organizing societies and meetings where pledges of total abstinence were signed, often with much ceremony, as if the act of refusing drink could bring salvation not only to individuals but to entire communities. Meanwhile, opium moved quietly, more discreet than the rowdy laughter of the pub, yet no less powerful. Sold as medicine, it was present in every home. In the cramped quarters of the poor, a bottle of Godfrey's cordial sat beside the bread and tea, ready to calm restless children. In the spacious rooms of the wealthy, laudanum rested in polished cabinets taken for sleeplessness or melancholy. Physicians recommended it for coughs, for fevers, for nearly every ailment. Women, in particular, were prescribed laudanum for what doctors called nervous complaints, for hysteria, for sadness, for the unnamed weariness that weighed on them. Some grew dependent, slipping into a quiet fog that dulled both pain and joy. Writers and artists spoke of the strange dreams it brought. They described vast landscapes of the imagination, visions that seemed more real than reality itself. Yet they also described the torment of addiction, the long nights of despair when the drug's grip tightened and would not let go. In their confessions, we glimpse both the fascination and the horror that opium inspired, and we see how deeply it shaped not only private lives, but also the literature and art of the age. Children, too, were not spared. To picture a mother gently pouring syrup onto a spoon and pressing it to the lips of her infant is to see both love and desperation. The baby's cries ceased, but at what cost? Reports surfaced of infants who wasted away, their bodies weakened by constant doses. Reformers warned against the practice, but for many mothers, there was no alternative. With work demanding their presence, with hunger gnawing at their families, with little support from society, the soothing syrup seemed the only way to survive another day. The government slowly began to act. Laws were introduced to restrict the sale of opium, to require clearer labeling, to prevent children from being dosed too easily. Doctors, once careless in their prescriptions, grew more cautious. Yet the change was slow, and for decades laudanum remained a common feature of daily life. As for alcohol, the debate raged on. Taverns were criticized for corrupting morals, yet defended as places of fellowship. Some towns passed local laws limiting the hours of sale, closing pubs earlier in the evening, or restricting licenses. In Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, the temperance cause grew strong, tied closely to religious revival movements. Preachers thundered against drink, urging men to abandon their pence and take up the pledge. Entire families sometimes marched proudly in processions, carrying banners that proclaimed sobriety and salvation. Children wore little blue ribbons to show their teetotal faith. But for every man who signed the pledge, there was another who broke it. The grip of alcohol was hard to escape. In the slums of London, gin shops remained crowded, their cheap spirits offering a quick oblivion from the misery of poverty. Reformers painted shocking pictures of drunkenness, of women collapsing in the streets, of men lying insensible in the gutter. They hoped that fear would drive people away from drink, but often the fear was drowned, like everything else, in another glass. In prisons and asylums, The consequences of addiction were plain. Doctors observed the trembling hands, the confused minds, the wasted bodies of those who could not stop drinking or dosing themselves with opium. Some attempted cures, cold baths, strict diets, religious instruction, but results were poor. Addiction was not well understood, and sympathy was often scarce. The sufferer was blamed for weakness, for moral failure, rather than recognized as a patient in need of care. And yet, life went on. Families gathered around fires, fathers read newspapers, children played in the streets, and in nearly every household, the bottle was near at hand. Perhaps a glass of sherry after dinner, perhaps a spoonful of laudanum for a cough, perhaps a pint of beer after work. These habits were not seen as extraordinary. They were part of the ordinary rhythm of life, as natural as drinking tea or saying prayers before bed. As the century wore on, new voices joined the debate. Scientists began to study addiction more carefully, to understand the physical effects of alcohol and opium on the body. Politicians considered stricter regulations, though always with caution, for fear of angering voters who cherished their comforts. Journalists wrote exposés, reformers published pamphlets, and families continued to live in the space between condemnation and acceptance. In the countryside too, drink and opium had their place. Agricultural laborers, after long days in the fields, gathered at small village inns. Mothers in cottages kept cordial for their children. The rhythms of rural life, though gentler than the roar of the city, still carried hardship and still sought relief in the same old companions. It is easy to imagine that an age defined by railways and factories, by empire and progress, would leave little room for such quiet dependencies. But in truth, it was precisely the harshness of industrial life, the relentless pace of change, that made people cling all the more to the solace of alcohol and opium. In their laughter, in their dreams, in their silence, these substances shaped Victorian England just as surely as steam engines and telegraphs did. By the closing decades of the century, awareness had grown. Campaigners celebrated victories, pointing to declining sales of certain opium medicines, to stricter laws on public houses, to growing numbers of teetotal societies. Yet the reality was more complicated. Alcohol remained deeply embedded in social life, and opium, though restricted, still lingered in medicine cabinets. The struggle was not over, and in many ways, it had only just begun. As we drift further into this history, we see a society both proud of its progress and trapped by its habits, a society that sought comfort in bottles and vials, that debated endlessly whether those comforts were salvation or destruction. We see ordinary people doing what they could to endure the hardships of their days, finding moments of relief, however fleeting, and we see the reformers, the preachers, the doctors, trying to change a tide that seemed unstoppable. This, then, was the other face of Victorian England. Not the polished face of empire and invention, but the wary face of those who sought comfort in drink and drug, who lived their days in a haze both comforting and destructive, who passed on to their children not only their names and their trades, but also their habits. It is a story without great battles, without grand triumphs, but it is a story of real life, of the quiet struggles and small escapes that made up the daily existence of millions. And so the century passed, with its progress and its pain, with its inventions and its addictions, leaving behind a legacy that still echoes today. For when we speak of Victorian England, we must remember not only the factories and the railways, but also the taverns and the chemists, the bottles of gin and the vials of laudanum, and the people who relied on them to make life just a little more bearable. Let us drift even deeper now into the quieter, less glamorous corners of Victorian England, where the struggle between habit and reform continued, where lives were shaped not only by industry and invention, but also by the daily presence of alcohol and opium. Imagine again the dim glow of the gaslight, the smell of smoke lingering in narrow streets, the heavy tread of boots on cobblestones, after long hours of labor. The clatter of factories fades into the distance, and we enter the private world of homes, hospitals, prisons, and chapels, where the story of drink and drug carried on in countless small ways. In many working-class households, alcohol was a familiar companion. The man of the house might finish his shift at the docks or in the factory and turn without hesitation to the tavern on the corner. Inside, his mates were already gathered, tankards in hand, laughter filling the smoke-thick air. Here, among friends, the weariness of life was softened, even if only for an hour. Yet when the man returned home, if he returned at all, his wages were lighter, and his wife sat by the fire with worry carved into her face. Children, hungry and restless, looked up with fear as the door creaked open. For them, drink was not a joy but a thief, stealing food from their mouths and peace from their nights. The temperance reformers saw this clearly, and they set themselves against it with unyielding passion. They organized meetings in church halls, where speeches echoed against wooden rafters. Men and women stood proudly to take the pledge, promising never again to touch a drop of alcohol. Some wore badges or ribbons to declare their sobriety, while others carried pamphlets to hand out in the streets. Entire families joined temperance parades, banners fluttering above their heads, while bands played solemn hymns. Children were brought along to learn from an early age that drink was a destroyer. And yet, even as these processions marched through the streets, the taverns remained crowded, their doors swinging wide for those who chose the warmth of a pint over the stern warnings of preachers. Opium, meanwhile, remained quieter, more insidious, more respectable in appearance. In the homes of the poor, the bottle of cordial was as common as bread or salt. Mothers reached for it without hesitation when their children cried through the night, knowing that a spoonful would bring silence. To them, it was not wickedness, but necessity, a small mercy in lives too hard to bear without help. In the homes of the wealthy, laudanum was taken in polished glasses, prescribed by doctors for sleeplessness, for headaches, for melancholy. It was spoken of as medicine, yet its grip was no less strong. A lady might sip it in her drawing room, her fine dress arranged carefully about her, and no one would think her scandalous for doing so. Hospitals, too, relied on opium. Surgeons used it to dull pain, to quiet patients who would otherwise scream through procedures that seemed barbaric by modern standards. Doctors mixed it into tonics for fevers, for coughs, for digestive troubles. There was little they did not prescribe it for, and so it found its way into nearly every illness and nearly every household. But the cost was high. Patients grew dependent, unable to sleep or eat without it. The line between healing and harming blurred until it was almost invisible. In prisons and asylums, the darker side of addiction was laid bare. Wardens spoke of men trembling and raving, their bodies broken by drink, their minds haunted by opium dreams. Some prisoners had committed crimes in drunken fits, striking out at wives or strangers in moments of rage. Others had stolen to feed their dependents, slipping coins from drawers or goods from markets. In the asylums, doctors experimented with treatments, strict diets, icy baths, endless sermons. But relief rarely came. Addiction was not understood as an illness. It was seen as weakness, as sin, as moral decay. The sufferers were often blamed for their own condition, left to endure both their cravings and their shame. Still, society was changing. Scientists began to study more carefully the effects of alcohol and opium, publishing reports that shocked readers with tales of widespread harm. Newspapers printed stories of children dosed to death with soothing syrups, of families ruined by drink, of poets and thinkers destroyed by their laudanum habits. Campaigners used these stories as weapons, urging Parliament to act, demanding stricter laws. Slowly, rules were introduced. Opium was labeled more clearly, its sale restricted. Alcohol was regulated, its hours of sale shortened in some towns. But none of this could erase the deep habits of a people who who had long relied on these substances to soften their lives. In the countryside, where life followed the rhythms of the seasons, drink was just as present. Farm laborers gathered in small inns at the end of a long day, their clothes muddy, their bodies aching. A pint of ale was as much a part of their supper as bread and cheese. Harvest festivals were marked by drinking, laughter spilling out into the night air. Even the church sometimes turned a blind eye, for to deny the labor his pent was to invite resentment. And so the reformers, though loud in their voices, often struggled to reach the hearts of those whose lives were bound up with such rituals. For women, the story was more complex. Many suffered under the weight of husbands drinking, yet many also turned to laudanum themselves. Doctors prescribed it readily for so-called female complaints, for nerves, for exhaustion. A woman might spend her mornings caring for children, her afternoons sewing or cleaning, and her evenings in quiet despair, soothed only by the dark liquid in a small bottle. Dependence crept upon her softly, unnoticed until it was too late. Some grew pale and withdrawn, their energy drained, their eyes dull. Others lived in a half-dream, neither fully awake nor fully asleep, carried along by the drug's embrace. Children, too, bore the burden. Not only were they given opium in syrups, but they also grew up in homes where alcohol consumed the wages that should have fed them. Some were sent to workhouses when their parents could no longer provide. Others roamed the streets, ragged and hungry, scavenging for scraps. The reformers spoke passionately of saving the children, of protecting them from both poverty and the habits that deepened it. Schools were opened, charities formed, missions established in the poorest districts. But always the tavern was near, always the chemist's shop ready to sell another bottle. The debate over drink and drug touched every level of society. Politicians argued in parliament, preachers thundered in pulpits, reformers handed out tracts on street corners. But for ordinary men and women, the debate mattered little compared to the reality of daily life. A man with aching muscles and an empty stomach thought not of legislation, but of the pent that would ease his pain. A mother with a restless child thought not of reform, but of the cordial that would bring silence. The struggle between principle and necessity was lived not in speeches, but in kitchens, in taverns, in quiet bedrooms where bottles sat waiting. And so the century wore on with progress and invention on one side and drink and opium on the other. Railways spread, telegraphs hummed, factories roared, and through it all, people reached for their bottles. It was not only despair that drove them, but also habit, ritual comfort. A pint at supper, a glass at a wedding, a bottle of medicine in the cupboard. These were as much a part of Victorian life as work, prayer or rest. By the closing decades, the reformers could point to some success. Temperance societies grew stronger, opium laws were tighter, and awareness was greater, yet the habits endured, deeply rooted in the culture. The story of Victorian England cannot be told without them. They shaped lives quietly, invisibly, as real as the smoke from factory chimneys, as constant as the ticking of the clock. They were both the balm and the burden of an age, the comfort and the curse of a people who lived through one of the most transformative centuries in history. And so, when we think of that age now, we must remember not only the grand inventions, the stern morals, the glittering empire, but also the simple bottles and glasses, the taverns and chemists, the laughter and the silence they produced. For behind every great story of progress lies the quieter story of how people endured, how they softened the edges of hardship, how they found comfort in small doses of alcohol and opium, and how they lived their lives between duty and desire, between reform and habit, between light and shadow. The fog rolls low over London's streets, curling around lampposts, seeping into alleyways, softening the sound of carriage wheels upon wet stones. The city, enormous and restless, moves with the pulse of industry, yet beneath its progress beats another rhythm, the steady, unseen thrum of addiction. By now, alcohol and opium are not simply substances in the Victorian world. They are fixtures woven into the fabric of daily life, as present as bread upon the table or coal in the grate. Picture the grand boulevards, lined with shops and fine buildings, gaslight glimmering on polished windows. Behind some of those windows, in the drawing rooms of the prosperous, bottles of laudanum rest discreetly on sideboards, their labels neat and proper. In the poorer quarters, where tenements rise in endless rows, bottles rest upon shelves too, though humbler in appearance. Half-empty vials of cordial, small jars of syrup, remnants of what the chemist sold the week before. The users differ little, whether among the rich or the poor. Relief, quiet, escape. Among politicians and thinkers of the time, debate swirls endlessly. Was it the moral failing of the people that they drank and dozed themselves into oblivion? Or was it the fault of society that hunger and toil drove men and women to seek solace? Parliamentary reports begin to appear, thick documents filled with testimony from doctors, clergy, policemen, and ordinary citizens. Stories within those pages are harrowing. Infants found lifeless after too much soothing syrup, laborers ruined by gin, middle-class wives slipping further into laudanum dreams, their vitality drained, their households neglected. These reports stir the public, though never enough to overcome habit. The churches thunder against it. In sermons across the land, voices rise in warning the wages of sin, the destruction of the family, the curse upon the nation. Congregations listen with bowed heads. But once the hymns are sung and the prayers finished, many walk past the same taverns on their way home. To live entirely sober is to live differently from one's neighbors, to step away from custom. And custom, as the Victorians know well, is a weight not easily lifted. Opium presents a subtler challenge. Unlike alcohol, it carries little stigma when prescribed. Physicians themselves defend its use. Without it, they argue, pain would run unchecked, sleeplessness would destroy minds, nervous disorders would multiply. Laudanum in neat doses, tinctures mixed with care, syrups administered with precision, these are medicine, not vice. But for every careful prescription, there are a dozen careless purchases at the local chemist. There, a mother may buy what she needs with no questions asked. There, a wary man may return week after week, his craving disguised as illness. In the countryside, life follows slower rhythms, yet the substances are present still. In farmhouses, cordial bottles sit upon rough, hewn shelves beside jars of preserves. When children wail, when stomachs ache, when nights grow long, the cork is pulled and silence returns. All flows freely at harvest festivals. Tankards raised under barn rafters strung with lanterns. Drink is not merely relief here. It is community, ritual, tradition. Reformers may ride out from towns to hold meetings in village chapels, their banners fluttering, their words earnest. But when the speeches end, the farmers return to their fields, and by evening the alehouses are once again filled with voices raised in song. For women, the story deepens still further. Some are victims of drink, their lives marked by the violence or neglect of drunken husbands. Others themselves are bound by opium, their medicine bottles tucked discreetly among sewing kits or beside their beds. Doctors write prescriptions for female troubles, for melancholy, for exhaustion, and women follow their advice faithfully. At first the relief is welcome, a gentle easing of nerves. But over months and years, dependence grows until it is no longer a choice. The face grows pale, the body weaker, the mind heavy with dreams that blur reality. Few speak of it openly. Respectability demands silence, and so the quiet epidemic continues, cloaked in the appearance of medical care. In asylums, the results of excess gather. Men and women alike arrive broken, trembling, caught in cycles of craving and collapse. The doctors here experiment with methods of cure, moral instruction, strict discipline, cold water baths, prayer. Some patients recover enough to leave, though many do not. Addiction is not yet understood as disease. It is judged instead as weakness. And so the afflicted bear not only their suffering, but also the condemnation of those around them. Meanwhile, on London's docks, another trade grows. Ships from far corners of the empire bring not only tea and textiles, but also opium itself, raw and ready for refinement. The British role in the opium trade abroad is well known, yet at home the same substance flows quietly into domestic bottles. The empire profits, and the people consume, and few pause to consider the irony. The temperance movement, however, refuses to fade. Its leaders understand the power of spectacle. They organize vast rallies, parades of men, women, and children through city streets, bands playing, banners high. Entire halls are filled with pledges signed in ink, families standing together to renounce drink. Songs are sung with fervor, stories told of lives redeemed. For some, these gatherings bring genuine change, offering fellowship and support to those struggling against habit. For others, they remain only spectacles, moments of inspiration, quickly forgotten. Children stand at the heart of reformers' pleas. Pamphlets depict them in stark images, small bodies, laid out in coffins after overdoses, wide eyes staring from behind ragged clothes, hungry faces framed by squalid tenements. Save the children, the reformers cry. Protect them from the poison of gin, from the treachery of soothing syrups. Establish schools, provide safe play, teach them the value of sobriety. And indeed, charities rise up, missions open their doors, schools expand. Yet still, in countless kitchens, mothers measure out spoonfuls, fathers stumble home with empty purses, children curl against each other on cold floors. Art and literature, too, reflect the age's entanglement with these substances. Poets write of dreams and visions, some inspired, some haunted. Novelists depict taverns as dens of ruin, their characters' downfalls tied to drink. Painters capture the contrast. Glittering parties with glasses raised, alongside grim alley scenes of drunks collapsed in the gutter. Society cannot look away, for the mirror is held before it. Yet even those who condemn often partake quietly themselves, revealing the contradictions of the time. As the century wears on, science advances, chemical analysis begins to separate substances, to measure doses more carefully, to warn of dangers. Medical journals publish findings that link excessive opium use to decline of health, that describe alcohol's destructive effects on the body. Gradually, regulations tighten. Chemists are required to keep records of opium sales. Laws restrict hours of tavern operation. The state takes a firmer hand, though never firm enough to erase the habits of generations. And so, by the final decades of the Victorian era, the picture is one of both continuity and change. The empire stands vast, industry thrives, railways span the land, communication speeds ever faster. Alongside all this progress, in parlours and tenements alike, bottles remain. The reformers continue their marches, the doctors their prescriptions, the chemists their sales, the families their struggles. Alcohol and opium do not vanish, they adapt, they endure. To walk the streets of late Victorian England, then, is to see both faces of the age. The proud monuments of progress rising high, and the quiet figures in shadowed doorways, sipping from bottles or clutching vials. The nation dreams of greatness, yet those dreams are softened, blurred, by substances taken daily, hourly, in countless small doses. It is a story not of villains and heroes, but of people, ordinary men and women seeking relief, seeking comfort, seeking escape. Some found ruin, others found only temporary ease. Some were lifted by reform, others sank despite it. All lived within a world where alcohol and opium were as much a part of life as work, prayer, or family. And as the lamps are lit across the city, as the fog thickens and the streets grow quiet, we can imagine the clink of glasses in taverns, the hush of children finally asleep after a spoonful of cordial, the sigh of a lady easing her nerves with laudanum. It is the sound of an age caught between progress and peril, between invention and indulgence, between the sober march of history and the drowsy pull of dreams.